Welcome back to the Arise interview, where we speak to the newsmakers as well as ordinary people doing extraordinary things around the world and featuring the voices at the heart of the stories. I'm Sumner Sambo. No one can deny that Muammar Gaddafi was a controversial figure that sparked much debate about African leadership and the limits of authoritarianism. Whether or not Libya has been able to move past authoritarian rule and forgo suicide bombings and targeted killings for more democratic principles is up for debate. As terrorism and insecurity in the Sahel and across the continent grows, the North African country is still struggling to rectify deep historic divides. On the 10th anniversary of Gaddafi's death, we take a look at how far the Libyan nation has come. To help us analyze Gaddafi's legacy and the current state of affairs in Libya, as well as the spread of terrorism in the North African and Sahel region, I have here with me in the studio the UK-based international defense and security analyst, David Otto. Glad to have you again, David.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, good to have you here in Nigeria.
Yes.
Well, 10 years after Gaddafi, lots of reminiscences, a lot of Libyans actually saying that, look, they missed that period, that golden period when Gaddafi was alive. And it's been a mixed reactions for some, while some are also saying that they cherish the freedom of speech that they have now, although their pockets are empty. What's your view on that?
I think there is a huge divide. As you rightly said, we 10 years, the 10th decade anniversary since Muammar Gaddafi, that scene of him being killed, which was a precursor to the so-called the revolution that took swept across North Africa. I think what we've seen very much is the decline rather than a progress, because obviously the hope was that Libya would have some democracy after Gaddafi and also stability. I mean, that is perhaps what it was sold as a narrative by France and the NATO forces that helped Libyans to overthrow and assassinate Gaddafi. But what we've seen after 10 years is that perhaps Libya regressed the 42 years before Gaddafi came to power, whereby you've got a situation which is far more worse. There is no democracy, as you know. You've got different governments, government of national accord being supported by the UN. You've got the Libyan National Army by General Khalifa Haftar, and then of course now you have the unity government, which seems to be the interim or transitional government preparing for the elections. But that is just the official platforms. You still have terrorists from Al Qaeda and ISIS taking territory. You've got militias who are responsible for all sorts of malaise within the country. Then you have tribes fighting against each other for power. Libya is in total chaos, and nationally there is no stability. Regionally, you've seen the outflux of terrorism from Libya onto the Sahel, Mali, Burkina Faso, the Taco-Goma region, even as far as Nigeria, where you've got ISIS networks working together with Islamic State.
Yeah, very interesting development you've painted here.
Yeah.
A lot of people who do not know Muammar Gaddafi will be interested in knowing the sort of leader that he was. Just use your African lens to help us understand the kind of leader he was, irrespective of the way the West painted him.
I think Muammar Gaddafi was a good example of culture eats strategy for breakfast. He knew very well how diverse and how complicated and complex the Libyan society is. It's ruled by tribes and factions, and he had a very good hold of how to put these groups together. Now, I'll bet the fact that it was described by many as a dictatorial way of running the country, which no one can dispute. But what Gaddafi did during his years was to bring unity, and he was looking further than just Libya. He was looking at bringing unity towards Africa. He was looking at bringing unity towards the region. So this is somebody who understood the mindset of Libyans. He understood the mindset of the various traditional factions and that exist within the Libyan society.
Yeah, because in my research I discovered that there are about 140 tribes.
Yes.
With many of these cultures never having anything to relate with each other over the past.
Yes.
But in 1969, when Gaddafi came into power, he made it a conscious effort to try to unify all these tribal warlords into one and drive a nation that will have very good economic and human development indices. And there's that debate if he actually achieved a lot of that human development indices or not.
That is where the Western strategy of taking out Gaddafi did not consider. What they thought, just like they did in Afghanistan, was we get in there, we introduce democracy, we take out the leader, and then kind of a regime change, and everything is going to be very smooth. But what they failed to understand was that Libya has its specificities in terms of its culture, in terms of the various tribes. Now, they did not really, Gaddafi did not succeed to unify all the tribes, but a huge majority of the tribes, had their interest being looked after. The Libyans had various amenities, they had free education. There are things which, if you look at what we describe as the last known good, that is, before the overthrow of Muammar Gaddafi, a lot of Libyans that I speak to today are regretting the fact that they had believed, being sold this narrative that somehow, democracy was suitable. But what they failed to understand was that, Libya is a tribal society, and where you do not have a personality like Muammar Gaddafi that can unify the country, then you've got a problem. And this is where the issue is, and is spreading across, Africa.
Yeah, and we'll keep wondering, people like Khalifa Haftar, who used to be with Gaddafi and eventually broke away from Gaddafi, was trying to present himself as a leader in the mold of Gaddafi after his exit.
Perfect.
Why do you think he failed to actually win over the hearts and minds of Libyans, and he's just been restricted to the east of the country?
Now, the biggest problem that General Haftar has, the self-proclaimed general has had, using his platform, the Libyan National Army, is that he has some of the national support. He doesn't have the support of the tribes, and most of the most powerful tribes. The Gaddafi tribe is one of them. There are so many powerful tribes that do exist within Libya. He doesn't have the support of that. Now, that is made worse by the factions that are in support of the government of the National Accord, which also doesn't have the national support, but has the international backing. So you've got two main factions, one which is supported internationally, doesn't have the local support, one which has some of the local support, doesn't have the international backing. So it's a scenario of looking for a third party, and that is why many have talked about the son of Muammar Gaddafi, Dr. Saif Islam Gaddafi, that he could unite both factions. But the international community has labeled him as, an unwanted person or a terrorist or whatever titles they've, given to him. And that makes it very difficult for him to come into the picture. Now, I'm not saying that we're looking at a monarchy where son succeeds father. But what we're talking about here is somebody who understands the culture and strategy to rule Libya.
Very interesting indeed. And we'll be talking about Gaddafi's dreams for United Africa when we come back, because he had proposed the United States of Africa, yes, and all of that. But just quickly, as we try to see Libya draw up a united country, do you think that the proposed elections in the December would actually hold?
Now,
just very quickly.
Of course, yes, elections have always been proposed. This is not the first time that it's failed. What I've often said is elections are not a solution to the division that Libya is going through. So it's not as if you bring elections, then everything is going to be fine. What you need to do is, first of all, ensure that you can unite the country, then come to elections. Okay, very interesting indeed. You're still watching the Rise interview. Plenty more still ahead, including we continue our chat with African Affairs analyst David Otto against the backdrop of the 10-year anniversary of Muammar Gaddafi's death. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview. Now, 10 years since the Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi was killed by rebels, the nation is still struggling to emerge from the violence sparked by its overthrow. Some analysts say violence in Libya has worsened over the years and has spread to other North African countries and nations in the Sahel. There's also the unsettling rise of terrorist groups in the region, with Boko Haram and ISWAP causing insecurity in Nigeria, as well as increasing violence in Burkina Faso, Chad, Mali, Mauritania, and Niger. And the African Affairs analyst David Otto is still with me in the studio to speak further on these developments. Thanks, David, for still being with us here. And I would want to start this segment with,
you know, that idea of Gaddafi actually trying to build a United States of Africa before it crumbled, and then we've seen especially the Sahel region in crumble since his death. Tell us something about that.
I think what Gaddafi wanted to do is what most African leaders that have passion, for the unity of Africa, the Kwame Nkrumahs had thought about. He wanted to develop a one Africa system whereby, all the African countries, so some kind of, the United States of Africa. And in order for him to do that, he understood that, of course, there were, diverse opinions, throughout the continent as to whether that was going to be a possible strategy. But Gaddafi had the funds, he had the structural, program in mind, and that was a threat to the, to the Western countries. The United States of America, for example, did not, want to see an Africa that is united. So many
especially
Western
under
countries.
Gaddafi.
Yes, under a Gaddafi. So this was where Gaddafi's problems, were triggered in terms of him being deposed. And this is something which I think it's very difficult to achieve, taking into context.
Well, but he had already started that. He first started by building Libya into a model country,
of course,
with very good human and development indices.
Yes.
And I just want to say, state something. The United Nations has sometime in 2010, I had read, where they had actually said that the human development indices in that country was one of the highest in the world. And after building that model society in Libya, now he used Libyan wealth to actually invest in other countries. I mean, I've been to other countries within the West African sub-region, and you see his footprints. Like in Mali, he built hotels, bridges, and all of that. In Chad, he helped build certain infrastructure there, but also supporting separatist movements in some areas. And in Nigeria, he also supported certain groups. And then at a point in time, you will now hear him saying that Nigeria should be broken into tribal and ethnic lines, and that cost him much. He lost a lot of alliances, and eventually, when the West came for him, there was no one to support his ambition. Do you think he was too ambitious?
I think, Muammar Gaddafi was the good, the bad, and the ugly. So he had very good plans for Africa. At the same time, he had his own personal opinion in terms of how different African states, were dealing with maybe groups that wanted separation and all that. What I think is important for us to look at now is the impact that the taking out of Gaddafi. He said it himself. I was coming to that. That once he's taken out, there will be instability in the region, and not just in the region. That's what has happened. But also, what we see, Libya it is placed in a very strategic position. It protects that boundary between Europe and then North Africa, but then also the Sahel. So what we have now, as he had predicted, and his son had said the same, is Europe being worried about the migration issues, smuggling of humans and drugs. Come towards the Sahel, you've got terrorists raining terror within the Malian side, within Burkina Faso, Chad, right up to Nigeria and the rest. And then within Libya itself, you still have that chaos within the country. So whether you look at it from a national point of view, from the Libyan perspective, or from the international perspective, which is the European countries, or from the African perspective, nobody has gained from the overthrow of Muammar Gaddafi. He may have had his vices, which we do recognize, but I think what he thought about the stability of Africa was also going to have a positive impact on the European countries. But what Europe did not want was a united Africa by Gaddafi.
Yeah, and let's talk about how his death led to the proliferation of small arms and light weapons across the region, especially in West Africa. We've seen that route coming all the way from Libya down to Mali and all of that down to Nigeria and destabilizing these economies. A lot of this has even led to assassination of some presidents. You could see, for example, the Chadian leader being taken away and all of that. Tell us how much that is a problem within the sub-region.
Now, the premise of that is wherever you destabilize any nation, you would have, proliferation of small arms and heavy weapons, moving from one area to another. You've seen the same case with when the Americans were withdrawing from Afghanistan, what that meant. So with the overthrow of Gaddafi and the instability that followed from there, of course, the NATO did not have a plan in terms of what they wanted to do after Gaddafi. France did not have a plan. And what made it worse was that Gaddafi had the backing of the Azawad, region. And, some of these tribes, in the northern part of Mali, some of these tribes helped him to fight against his opponents. But once he had, been overthrown, all this, the Azawad region decided to, okay, let's take all these arms and cross over to Mali and see if we can create what they call the movement, the national movement for the liberation of the Azawad, the MNLA. So you had that flow of weapons, and then it was made worse by, France said we would, introduce Operation Bakin to chase them away, and then it became worse. Jihadists came into the play. So the Libya's instability has exposed this idea of regime change. Because we don't like how a leader's policies are, and we do not want him to be plucked out. He should be plucked out, and we institute some artificial system which we can back in the hope that it will some way.
And that takes me actually to the politics of foreign intervention, especially the Western powers. You could actually see Russia and France and all of that supporting Khalifa Haftar, and then you could see the Tripoli-based government, almost collapsing at a point in time because they weren't getting much support. Eventually, they got some support, and then you could see this inter-regional war that's ongoing there. Just tell us about it, especially the involvement of Turkey, United Arab Emirates, and all of that.
Yeah, so all these, various factions support one group or the other. As you rightly mentioned, Turkey, supports the government of national accord, and then Khalifa Haftar is supported by the UAE. Now, where there is chaos, there's opportunity. Libya has been a very rich country, as we know, in terms of resources. I mean, people talk of oil. Now, somebody is going to say oil is no longer relevant. It is still relevant as we speak. It was relevant when he was taken out of power. So there has been a scramble for geopolitical positions. There's been proxy wars being taking place within Libya itself, as you rightly said. So all this is as a result of this idea of regime change, which of course we saw the same being replicated in countries like Syria. But I think the key point, which Africans have to really understand, is the fact that as long as we continue to support the Western intervention within Africa, whether they have, because there is always this narrative that has been created. We're coming because we want to remove a dictator who has been there for years. There is no human rights. But what we end up with at the end of the day is still a system which is worse than what we thought we were trying to create.
And there's been a lot of regret on the intervention in Libya, starting from the United States. Barack Obama has said that the intervention there and the death of Gaddafi will actually bring peace, democracy, and all of that. But we haven't seen that happening.
But I think
you could see what happened in Benghazi, and then you could see the French, even the Russians. I mean, it's all looking like a mess.
I think that, all these statements that the US makes, the UN, about this is a mess. These are just rhetorics. The problem is still there. What have you done to resolve the problem? Now, I think there is a deliberate attempt by these very huge powers, to allow the Sahel region to continue to be unstable, and then somehow find their ways and position themselves, within the region. See what is happening in Mali, where the French are clashing with the Russian interest in that region, because now the French are being threatened by the involvement of Russia. They say the Wagner group is there. I mean, and all that. The United States is also there. The UK is there. So all this talk of, we issuing strong languages, as the UN always does, doesn't actually help. What I think will help is them giving the ability for Libyans to be able to come up with something much more concrete.
As we try to round off this conversation, a lot of persons have said that Gaddafi made a model use of oil funds to build a very viral society that was accessible to all and helpful to all, with a lot of social benefits. Tell us about that.
I think what Gaddafi did, again, as you said, was he understood not just what Libyans needed in order to keep Libya stable. He made sure that the social system, the health system, the economy was very powerful. He distributed wealth in such a way that, of course, there is no country that, no matter what you do, you wouldn't have opposition. He did have opposition within some tribes, but he understood the dynamics of the country. Now, What he did not understand was that, irrespective of, how much you want to please the Western countries, they would always not want to see an African country that is stable, an African country that has a leader who wants to see a United States of Africa. So what I think is, the African Union has to wake up. They have to take responsibility and place Libya into the hands of Libyans rather than international organizations.
As Libya heads for elections.
If it heads for elections.
Yeah, in December, we've seen lots of foreign support coming in again from France. There's a summit scheduled for next month in France, and all these powers are actually saying that they are supporting Libya to ensure that there's a return to democracy. Do you think that other African leaders are playing enough role to ensure that Libya becomes united under a democratic government?
I think most African countries have, sat on their hands, when it comes to the situation in Libya. And I can guarantee you that elections themselves cannot be sustainable in a country that is so much divided.
Yeah, but they just have to start from somewhere.
If one faction,
and considering the devastation that has happened because of the failure of a centralized government that's democratic in Libya, I think it's in the interest of all African countries to support a Libyan government.
I think where they want to, where
they
should start is find a way of uniting Libyans rather than find a way of getting one faction to win an election, which is going to be disputed by another. So African countries have to come up with an African strategy, bringing Libya on board. It shouldn't be some kind of a strategy that is sponsored by the Western countries, because Libyans will know that it is still not in the interest of Libyans, and it wouldn't be in the interest of Africans either.
Well, there's no way you can push away Western interests from that country as long as they still have oil. David Otto, an African affairs analyst, we must thank you so much for that.